When I first moved into Maplewood Estates, I thought I had finally found peace. The streets were lined with maple trees that glowed gold every autumn. The lawns were meticulously trimmed, and every mailbox was painted in the same muted shade of forest green. It was the kind of neighborhood that appeared in real estate brochures and retirement dreams. The kind where every neighbor waved, every porch had a rocking chair, and the smell of barbecues filled the air on weekends. I had bought the house after years of saving. It wasn't extravagant, just a two-story with white shutters, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch that faced the sunrise. To me, it was everything I'd worked for. The peace, the stability, the small-town calm I had been craving after years of chaotic city life. But as I would soon learn, Maplewood Estates wasn't run by friendly neighbors. It was ruled by a self-proclaimed queen, the head of the Homeowners Association. Her name was Karen Whitmore. She was the kind of person who seemed born to enforce rules. Her blonde hair never moved, her pastel cardigans looked starched, and her clipboard might as well have been an extension of her hand. At first, I didn't mind her. She greeted me with that tight, polite smile the day I moved in and handed me a welcome packet. Inside were pages of rules about paint colors, acceptable garden gnome sizes, trash can placement, and lawn height limits. It seemed ridiculous, but I told myself it was fine. Every community had its quirks. The first month went smoothly enough. I repainted my shutters to meet the approved aesthetic, kept my lawn trimmed to regulation height, and parked my truck inside the garage to avoid fines. But peace in Maplewood was fragile, and it shattered the day I built a small wooden shed in the backyard. I had gotten permission from the city, all legal and permitted, but I hadn't thought to clear it with the HOA. Karen noticed it the very next morning. The note she left on my door was written in neat, almost artistic cursive, but the words were sharp as knives. She claimed the shed disrupted the neighborhood harmony and ordered me to remove it immediately. I tried reasoning with her through emails, polite, professional messages explaining that the structure was fully legal. But she wasn't interested in law or logic. She was interested in control. The fine started small, $50 for non-compliance, then $100, then $200. When I ignored them, she escalated, filing complaints and threatening liens. The neighborhood began to whisper. Some pitied me, others avoided me entirely, and a few seemed to enjoy watching Karen's crusade unfold like it was some kind of suburban entertainment. Weeks turned into months, and the battle only grew uglier. She began sending inspectors, really just her friends from the HOA board, to photograph my property. My mailbox was mysteriously knocked over one night. Another time, someone scattered trash across my driveway just before an HOA inspection. It was harassment, pure and simple. Still, I didn't bend. I rebuilt the shed, fixed the mailbox, and started documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every visit. I knew I was being targeted, and I wanted proof. Then one night, I noticed something strange. A silver sedan parked down the street, the same one that always seemed to appear whenever Karen came by. Its headlights flickered on just as I walked outside, and it sped off. It happened again a few nights later. That's when I started to feel unsafe in my own home. I installed cameras, hidden ones, small enough that no one would notice. I didn't tell anyone, not even the neighbors I still trusted. Something deep inside me whispered that I'd need them one day. That whisper turned prophetic faster than I could have imagined. It was a quiet Saturday evening in early spring. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the crickets had just started their chorus. I had gone to bed early after a long day of work on my back porch, sanding down an old rocking chair. Everything was calm, peaceful, until the smell of smoke woke me. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor's fireplace. Then I saw the orange glow through my window. It wasn't a distant light. It was alive, hungry, and spreading fast. Flames were climbing the porch posts. The dry wood crackled like bones snapping in the heat. I rushed outside barefoot, heart pounding, trying to grab a hose. But the fire had already consumed the corner of the house. The air burned my throat as I yelled for help, and distant voices answered as neighbors ran from their homes. Someone called the fire department. Someone else pulled me back as the roof started to cave. By the time the firefighters arrived, it was too late. My home, my dream, was gone. The next morning, all that remained were ashes and twisted metal. The chimney still stood like a monument to what used to be, but everything else had turned to black ruin. Insurance investigators combed through the debris, murmuring in low voices. They said it looked deliberate. Accelerants, traces of gasoline, someone had set it on fire, and then they found something else. On the side fence, barely visible in the soot, was a piece of paper pinned by a single nail. The wind had charred its edges, but the message was still readable. Maybe now you'll follow the rules. The handwriting was neat, elegant, familiar. It was Karen's. The evidence was circumstantial at first, until I checked my cameras. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. At 2:13 a.m., a figure in a light sweater walked up my driveway holding a red gas can. The camera caught her face clearly enough. It was her, the head of the HOA, the woman who had fined me for my shed. The woman who smiled as she destroyed my peace, Karen. Whitmore had burned my house to the ground. But what she didn't know was that I had everything I needed to make sure she paid for it, and as the police took her away in handcuffs 2 days later, she didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't even protest. She just stared at me, that same tight smile frozen on her face, as if she still believed she had the upper hand. She didn't, because I wasn't done yet. The morning after the fire felt unreal, as if I had woken up inside someone else's nightmare. The sky was gray and heavy, the air thick with the sour smell of wet ash. Fire trucks and police cars lined the street, their flashing lights reflecting off puddles of dirty water. My house was gone, nothing left but a smoking skeleton of beams and foundation. The life I had built there had turned to dust overnight. I stood behind the caution tape, clutching a cup of coffee I couldn't drink. Every sound, the hiss of steam, the crack of collapsing wood, the murmur of firefighters, felt distant, muffled, like I was underwater. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering behind hands. Some looked shocked. Others just looked curious, like it was another HOA headline for their morning gossip. And through it all, one face was missing, Karen Whitmore's. At first, the authorities treated it as an accident. Electrical fault, they said. Maybe a gas line leak. But I knew better. The moment I found that note nailed to my fence, my grief shifted into cold, hard determination. Karen had gone too far. What began as petty harassment had escalated into arson, and I was going to prove it. I gave the footage from my security cameras to the detectives assigned to my case. The moment they saw the video, their tone changed. The image wasn't perfect. It was grainy, the colors faded by the glow of firelight, but there was no mistaking her posture, her gait, her signature bob haircut. Karen was the one who'd poured gasoline around my porch. She was the one who lit the match. They told me to stay quiet, to let them handle it. But patience was something I no longer had. I'd lost my home, my belongings, my peace, and I wasn't about to lose the chance for justice, too. Over the next few weeks, the investigation expanded. Detectives searched Karen's property, her car, and even her HOA office. What they found was worse than anyone expected. In her garage sat an empty red gas can that matched the one from the footage. Her clothes had traces of accelerant, and tucked away in a filing cabinet were printed copies of every notice she'd ever sent me, marked with angry handwritten notes. Words like defiant, disrespectful, dangerous to community standards. The police called it obsession. I called it madness. The day they arrested her, the neighborhood gathered outside like it was a parade. Karen was led from her front porch in handcuffs, still dressed in her pastel cardigan, still trying to keep that calm, superior smile. But her hands trembled. For once, the Queen of Maplewood had lost her crown. The news spread fast. Local outlets ran headlines about the HOA arsonist, and soon everyone in the state knew her name. I watched the coverage from the hotel room I was staying in, my temporary home paid for by insurance advances. Reporters described her as a pillar of the community, a longtime civic leader, and a respected neighbor. They didn't know the Karen we knew. What followed was months of legal back and forth. Her lawyers claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that someone else could have framed her, that she'd been asleep at home that night. But I had proof, and I wasn't afraid to face her in court. Meanwhile, I began to rebuild my life, though not yet my home. Insurance was slow, paperwork endless, and every form seemed to ask me to relive the fire. I'd close my eyes at night and still see the flames dancing in the reflection of my window. The smell of smoke followed me everywhere, phantom traces that no shower could wash away. Despite the fear, I started piecing together a timeline for myself, documenting everything Karen had done. I compiled every letter, fine, photo, and HOA notice into a binder thicker than a phone book. I even printed the emails she'd sent me, each one more condescending than the last. When the trial finally began, it felt like a storm brewing after months of stillness. The courthouse was packed. Neighbors filled the benches, some out of curiosity, others out of guilt for having stood by in silence. I took my seat near the front, behind the prosecution's table, trying to steady my hands. Then she entered. Karen walked in like she owned the place, her posture straight, her chin lifted. She wore a gray suit and a smug expression that seemed to say she still believed this was all beneath her. For a moment, our eyes met. I saw no remorse, just defiance. The prosecutor began with the evidence, the footage, the gas can, the handwriting on the note, and the accelerant traces on her clothes. Each piece built the case brick by brick. When they played the security video for the jury, the courtroom fell silent. The grainy image flickered across the screen, showing the figure walking up my driveway, can in hand, flames erupting moments later. Karen didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the screen. Then came the witnesses. Neighbors testified about her long history of hostility, about how she threatened fines and called police on people for minor infractions. One man mentioned she once bragged about teaching lessons to rule breakers. Another said she'd been obsessed with me since the shed incident, muttering about how people like me ruin neighborhoods. By the third day of trial, the mask had started to slip. The confident posture gave way to clenched fists and sharp whispers between her and her attorney. The calm demeanor turned brittle. Her arrogance was cracking under the weight of truth. Meanwhile, I sat through every moment, silent, composed, but burning inside. Every photo of my destroyed home, every description of what she'd done, ripped open the wound again. But I stayed strong. I owed it to the memory of what I'd lost, and to the idea that justice might still exist in a world like this. Finally, it came time for my testimony. I described what life had been like before the fire, the harassment, the fines, the intimidation. I spoke about the night of the blaze, the sound of the crackling wood, the terror of watching everything I loved collapse in flames. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. I wanted the jury to feel what I had felt. When I stepped down from the stand, Karen wouldn't look at me. For the first time, I saw something new in her eyes. Not arrogance, not rage, fear. As the trial moved toward its end, the weight of her actions became impossible to deny. The evidence was overwhelming, the motive was clear, and the jury could see it all for what it was, a vendetta taken to monstrous extremes. Still, I knew the verdict wouldn't heal everything. No sentence could rebuild my home, replace the photographs, or erase the nights of smoke-filled nightmares, but it would mean that she couldn't hurt anyone else again. When the judge announced that sentencing would take place in 2 weeks, I felt both relief and dread. Relief that the battle was nearly over, and dread for what I'd see next. Because Karen would be there standing in front of that courtroom, facing the consequences of her actions. And I'd be there too, watching the woman who burned my life to ashes finally meet her judgment. The day of sentencing arrived heavy with anticipation. The courthouse was silent from the outside, but inside, the air pulsed with tension. Reporters gathered on the steps, microphones poised, cameras flashing as the story that had consumed the town neared its climax. The HOA arson case, they called it. To them, it was sensational. Suburban scandal, revenge, control, and fire. To me, it was the day I would finally see justice. As I stepped into the courtroom, a chill ran through me. The same walls that had heard my grief now held my hope. Every bench was filled. Neighbors, journalists, even people from nearby communities who had followed the case online. The smell of old wood and paper mixed with perfume and coffee. The murmur of whispers swelled and faded like waves. Then the side door opened, and Karen Whitmore entered. She walked in flanked by officers, dressed in a charcoal suit that did nothing to soften her hardened expression. Her once pristine hair was dull now, tied back too tightly as if she were clinging to control through sheer force. She glanced around the courtroom, scanning faces, and when her eyes found mine, she paused. For a fraction of a second, her lips curved. Not a smile, but something colder. It was the look of someone who still didn't understand the depth of her own downfall. The judge entered moments later, and the room fell silent. Papers shuffled, the gavel struck, and the sentencing began. The prosecution spoke first. Their words painted the picture clearly, a calculated act of vengeance, premeditated and fueled by obsession. They replayed key parts of the trial. The surveillance footage, the expert testimonies, the neighbors' statements about Karen's behavior. The prosecutor's voice was steady, methodical, precise. When they finished, they requested the maximum sentence for first-degree arson and endangerment of life. Then it was her defense's turn. They tried one last desperate attempt, citing stress, emotional instability, the supposed mental strain of managing an HOA. They argued that she had been pushed past reason by community disputes, by her sense of civic duty. The words made my stomach turn. They called her misguided, not malicious. They said she needed treatment, not punishment. But the room wasn't convinced. Not the judge, not the jury, not anyone who had seen the evidence. Then the judge turned to me. It was time for my victim statement. I rose slowly, my hands trembling as I carried the piece of paper I'd written and rewritten a dozen times. I stood before the courtroom, before Karen, and spoke. My voice cracked at first, but I steadied it, finding strength in the truth. I told them about the day I bought my house, the dream of a quiet life, the peace I thought I'd found in Maplewood Estates. I told them about the first letter she ever sent me, the first fine, the endless harassment that followed. I described what it felt like to wake up surrounded by fire, to watch everything I owned turn to ash, to stand barefoot on the lawn while my home collapsed. I spoke not of anger, but of loss, of fear, of how her obsession had stolen more than property. It had stolen security, trust, and peace. Then I looked directly at her. I wanted to see her face when I said it. When I told her that despite everything, she didn't destroy me. That my life would go on, that she would never again have the power to intimidate anyone. Karen didn't blink. She stared back, her lips pressed tight, her eyes unflinching. It was as if she refused to let even that moment break her. When I finished, I sat down, the silence behind me thick and suffocating. The judge nodded slowly, eyes heavy with the gravity of what had been said. Then, turning to Karen, he began his final address. He spoke of arrogance, of abuse of power, of how communities like ours relied on trust, and how she had turned that trust into a weapon. He described her actions not as a lapse in judgment, but as a deliberate act of cruelty. He called her a danger to every sense of decency that holds a neighborhood together. And then came the sentence. 20 years in state prison. No parole for at least 15. Restitution to cover the damages, mandatory counseling, and a permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association or community board ever again. A collective gasp filled the room. Some people whispered, others nodded. For me, the words echoed like a thunderclap, heavy, final, undeniable. Karen didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply stood there as if carved from stone, her jaw tight, her eyes hollow. Maybe she still didn't believe it. Maybe she couldn't. As the officers moved to escort her away, she turned her head one last time toward me. There was no apology in her eyes, only something darker. Not rage, exactly, but a kind of cold emptiness. Like she couldn't understand how her empire had crumbled so completely. When the door shut behind her, the tension in the room broke. Reporters rushed out, pens flying across notepads, cameras flashing as they tried to capture my face. Neighbors whispered words of sympathy. Others simply avoided me altogether, embarrassed to have once supported her. But I didn't stay for any of it. I walked out of the courtroom and into the autumn sunlight, taking the first full breath I'd had in months. The crisp air felt different, lighter somehow. The weight that had sat on my chest since the night of the fire began to lift slowly, painfully, but surely. Justice had been served. But closure, that was something else entirely. That night I drove to where my house once stood. The foundation had been cleared, the lot leveled, the charred remains hauled away. Only the stone chimney still stood, blackened but unbroken. I parked nearby and sat for a long while, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. I thought about everything that had happened, the years of saving, the months of harassment, the fire, the trial, the sentence, and I realized that while the house was gone, the lesson it left behind was still standing, as solid as that chimney. Evil can wear a smile. It can dress itself in pastels and carry a clipboard. It can hide behind neighborhood rules and polite words. But eventually, it reveals itself. And when it does, the truth burns brighter than any fire. As the stars came out and the night settled in, I made a silent promise to rebuild. Not just the house, but my life. Karen was gone. The nightmare was over. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because in Maplewood Estates, even with the queen dethroned, the ashes still whispered, and the neighbors who once stayed silent were beginning to speak. The weeks following the sentencing felt strangely hollow. For so long, every thought, every breath had revolved around the trial, the evidence, the hearings, the waiting for justice. Now that it was over, the quiet felt almost wrong. The silence that followed Karen's conviction was not peace. It was the uneasy calm that comes after a storm, when the debris still litters the ground and the air still smells faintly of smoke. I moved back into Maplewood Estates in early spring, into a small rental at the edge of the neighborhood. It wasn't easy returning. Every street, every sidewalk carried ghosts of the past. The corner where my house once stood had been cleared completely, just dirt, gravel, and the faint outline of what used to be my foundation. But I needed to be there. I needed to face it. When I drove past Karen's old home for the first time, it looked different. The manicured lawn was overgrown, the shutters peeling, the windows dark and empty. No one had bought it yet. The HOA had quietly removed her name from every document, every sign, every email chain. It was as if she had never existed, as if the community wanted to erase her memory entirely. But you can't erase a fire. The neighbors treated me differently now. Some greeted me with cautious smiles, others with apologies. They said things like, "We always knew she took things too far," or "We should have said something sooner." Their words were polite, but shallow, like they were trying to convince themselves as much as me. The same people who once whispered about my fines now avoided eye contact, as if guilt clung to them like smoke. A new HOA board had been elected, quieter, humbler, desperate to rebuild the community's reputation. They reached out to me personally, offering assistance with reconstruction, waiving all association fees, even suggesting a community fundraiser to help me rebuild. I accepted their offers, not out of gratitude, but necessity. Rebuilding a house was expensive, and insurance only went so far. The first time I stepped back onto my lot, I felt my chest tighten. The ground still bore faint scorch marks, and bits of melted metal were half buried in the dirt. But the air was clean now, fresh with the smell of earth and pine. I could almost imagine the sound of my old wind chime, the creak of my porch swing, the rustle of leaves in the trees. The construction crew began work a few weeks later. Every day I watched from my truck as the new foundation was poured, the beams rose, and walls began to take shape. It felt like watching something reborn, fragile, but alive. For the first time in a long time, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the past could stay buried. But then, strange things started happening again. It began small. A letter slipped under my door late one night. No envelope, no return address, just a piece of lined paper with the words, "You should have left when you had the chance." The handwriting wasn't Karen's, but the tone was the same, cold, controlled. A few days later, someone slashed the tires on the contractor's truck parked outside my lot. Then, one morning, I found my new mailbox dented and bent, a streak of black paint across the post like it had been struck deliberately. The police were called again. They said it was probably teenagers, maybe someone playing a cruel prank, but I wasn't so sure. Karen was gone, behind bars where she belonged. But that didn't mean her influence had vanished. Rumor spread through the neighborhood that some of her old HOA loyalists had formed a sort of unofficial committee. They claimed the community had been humiliated by her arrest, that I had exaggerated everything to destroy their reputation. They blamed me for the news coverage, for the drop in property values, for the whispers that still lingered at every block party. It was absurd, but it was real. The same pattern all over again, subtle harassment wrapped in politeness. Anonymous letters, petty vandalism, sideways glances. The difference was that this time, I wasn't afraid. I installed more cameras, reinforced my mailbox post, and reported every incident. Slowly, the intimidation stopped. Whoever was behind it realized I wouldn't bend, just like before. But the deeper wound wasn't the vandalism. It was the way the community treated the story itself. No one wanted to talk about Karen anymore. Her name became forbidden, as if silence could scrub away what she'd done. Yet at night, people still peeked through blinds at the dark house she'd left behind, its windows empty, its garden overrun with weeds. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the trees, her wind chimes still rang faintly. I tried to move forward. The new house rose steadily, brighter and stronger than before. It wasn't identical. I couldn't bring myself to rebuild it the same way, but I kept one detail: the old stone chimney. The builders had reinforced and cleaned it, leaving it as a standing relic of what had survived. The first evening after the roof went up, I stood alone in the new living room, the air still thick with the smell of fresh lumber and paint. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, bathed in the orange glow of sunset. For the first time in over a year, I felt something close to peace, but peace, I was learning, doesn't erase scars. It only teaches you how to live with them. Weeks later, I received a letter from the state corrections office. It was brief, just a notice that Karen had been transferred to a different facility, farther away, due to behavioral incidents. There were no details, only the dry tone of bureaucracy. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. I didn't need to know the details. Whatever happened there wasn't my concern anymore. Still, that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind wandered back to the courtroom, to her face as the sentence was read. That emptiness in her eyes, the way she looked at me, like she still believed she hadn't truly lost. I began to wonder if people like Karen ever really stopped fighting, if their power was tied not to rules or committees, but to the way they infected others with fear. And if so, maybe the only real way to defeat her wasn't through punishment, but by reclaiming what she tried to take: my life, my voice, my peace. As spring turned to summer, my new home was finished. I planted a small maple tree in the yard, a symbol of new beginnings. Every morning I sat on the new porch with coffee in hand, watching sunlight dance across its leaves. It wasn't the same life I once had. It was quieter now, more cautious, but stronger. The neighborhood had changed, too. People spoke softly, treated one another more gently. The new HOA avoided the spotlight, sticking to simple maintenance and polite notices. It was as if the entire community had been humbled by what had happened, burned by the same fire that destroyed my home. Yet sometimes, on still nights, I would hear faint laughter from down the street. A group of neighbors whispering too loudly, a car idling near Karen's old house. And every time I'd glance toward that empty property and feel that same familiar unease, because though she was gone, her shadow still lingered in Maplewood Estates, a reminder that even in the nicest neighborhoods, darkness can take root behind the prettiest lawns. And somewhere, far away behind concrete walls and steel bars, I knew she was still thinking of me. Months passed, and Maplewood Estates began to look like the peaceful neighborhood it pretended to be again. Lawns were green, mailboxes stood straight, and families waved to each other at sunset as if nothing had ever happened. But under that calm surface, the echoes of what Karen had done still lingered, faint but impossible to ignore. For me, life settled into a strange rhythm. I worked during the day, rebuilt my routines at night, and tried to forget the years of harassment that had led to that terrible fire. The new house had a different energy, brighter, sturdier, and filled with small reminders of resilience. Every nail, every board felt like a quiet victory. Yet no matter how much progress I made, a part of me remained on edge, listening for sounds that weren't there, waiting for a shoe that never dropped. That unease deepened one gray morning when I received a letter. It arrived without a return address, the envelope plain and unremarkable. At first I thought it was another HOA notice, a routine maintenance update or community announcement. But the handwriting on the front stopped me cold. Neat, precise cursive, the same kind she used on her notices. I stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment, staring at it, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. Karen was in prison. She couldn't have written me directly. Could she? I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. The message was short. You can rebuild walls. You can repaint wood, but you can't wash away guilt. Some of us never forget what you took. There was no signature. Just that same controlled handwriting, no smudges, no hesitation. My first instinct was denial. Maybe it was a copycat, someone trying to scare me. Maybe a leftover letter she'd sent before her arrest, misplaced and delivered late. But deep down I knew. The timing, the tone, it was deliberate. And it was meant for me. I contacted the authorities immediately. The local police came to collect the letter, bagging it as evidence. They promised to reach out to the prison and confirm whether Karen had been writing unauthorized correspondence. When they left, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty spot where the letter had been. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside made me tense. I replayed every memory in my mind, her face in court, her cold stare, her unflinching defiance. I tried to convince myself that she couldn't reach me anymore. But the letter had proved something chilling. Even behind bars, she still had ways to make her presence felt. A week later, the police confirmed it. Karen had not written the letter, at least not officially. But during a recent transfer, she'd befriended another inmate, a woman scheduled for release shortly before the letter arrived. That woman's last known address was one county over from Maplewood Estates. The officers suspected she had delivered the message on Karen's behalf. When I heard that, I didn't feel fear. I felt a kind of grim understanding. Karen hadn't just wanted revenge. She wanted to live in my head. And even from a prison cell, she was succeeding. That realization changed me. Instead of hiding from the shadow she left behind, I decided to confront it. I returned to her old house, now boarded up and quiet, and stood at the edge of the overgrown lawn. The windows were clouded with dust, the porch sagging under years of neglect. The community had voted to tear it down and rebuild. But part of me hoped they wouldn't. It felt right that it stood there decaying. A warning to anyone who believed control was the same as power. I walked around the side of the property, and there, half buried in the dirt, I found the old HOA sign that once bore her name. It was weathered and cracked, the letters faint but still visible. President K. Whitmore. I lifted it gently, brushed off the dirt, and stared at it for a long time. Then I left it there, leaning against the fence, like a gravestone for everything she had destroyed. After that day, something shifted inside me. The nightmares faded, the tension eased, and for the first time, I stopped checking over my shoulder. Karen's letter had been her last reach, a final attempt to remind me of what she'd taken. But in doing so, she'd given me something unexpected. Closure. I began to write, not for revenge, not for sympathy, but to remember. I documented everything, from the first HOA letter to the night of the fire, the trial, the aftermath, and the message. I wanted others to see how control can twist into obsession, how the appearance of perfection can hide the ugliest truths. I posted my story online, unsure what to expect. It spread fast. People shared it across forums and social media, calling it the HOA fire story. Some doubted it, others were horrified, but many saw their own experiences reflected in mine. Messages poured in from people who dealt with similar bullies in their communities, neighbors who abused power, boards that harassed homeowners, Karens who couldn't stand not getting their way, and suddenly, what had been my personal nightmare became something larger, a lesson, a warning, a voice for others too afraid to speak. Months later, I received another letter. This time it came from the state prison directly. The envelope bore the official seal, and inside was a short note on lined paper. The signature was unmistakable. You tell your story well. Maybe now you understand what power really is. Enjoy your peace while it lasts. There was no threat in the words. No fire, no venom. Just a quiet finality, as if she had accepted her fate but wanted me to remember her name. I didn't reply. I didn't show it to the police. I simply folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer as the first one. Then I walked outside onto my new porch and watched the sun rise over Maplewood Estates. The streets were calm, the lawns green again. The maple tree I'd planted had grown taller, its leaves fluttering in the early light. And for the first time since that terrible night, I felt no fear at all. Because I finally understood. She could haunt the edges of my memory. She could leave her marks and messages, but she no longer owned me. The fire had destroyed my house, but it had also burned away the illusion that people like her could control everything. Karen's story was over. Mine wasn't. And as the light spread across the quiet neighborhood, I made one last promise: to keep living, to keep rebuilding, and never again let anyone like her set fire to my peace.